All right, let's look at verse 8. And that is, then he, meaning God, gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision. I wonder if I can change this a little bit. So the Jews were very proud of the covenant they had of circumcision. So Stephen is saying something positive here. They would have liked this focus. Stephen says is positive. God gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision. Abraham became then the father of Isaac, circumcised him 8 days after his birth. So this is the foundation of the people of Israel. Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob. Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs. Verse 9, because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph. This patriarchs meaning the 12 sons of Israel. Well, 11 were jealous of Joseph. Benjamin wasn't there yet, but the patriarchs who was older than Joseph were jealous of Joseph. They sold him as a slave into Egypt, but he was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. God gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. So it's, there's nothing unusual about the history that he's recounting there. This is, it is a bit unusual in that he gives more attention to Joseph than most Jewish summaries of their history did. Ancient Jews had a kind of a style of writing that the modern scholars call it now the rewritten Bible. They just kind of tell the story again. And sometimes put it in their own words, sometimes add a little bit, take away. But very few of them gave much space to Joseph. So it's interesting that Stephen gives more space to Joseph. One reason, I think, why he does that is that word jealous. Stephen knows that the Jewish leaders are jealous of the popularity that the church is enjoying. So he didn't directly say that, but that may be a reason why he is using Joseph here. It's part of the pattern of how the Jews kind of rejected the people through whom God was working. God was working through Joseph. As we read in verse 11, a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering. Our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers, that's the patriarchs, on their first visit. On their second visit, he's skipping quite a bit of interesting history there, but he has to. He's had to get to his point. On their second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and then Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. So he speeds through a bit more of the story in verse 14. After this, Joseph sent for his father and his whole family, 75 in all. Now, there's a little question there because Genesis 46 says 70, a somewhat different number. Obviously they count the same way, 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're counting a different number of people. And how is that, people say? Well, there are two factors involved there. One is that the Greek translation of Genesis 46:27 actually says 75. And that is because they included other sons of Joseph. 2 sons born Joseph in Egypt at that time. There were 5 sons that came later, but whenever the translators got to that, they included the whole family. So in a way, what Stephen says here in Acts, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family. He didn't actually send for his own sons. They were already with him. But Stephen is using the number as he from the Greek translation, 75. And he's skipping some of the details of how things were counted. So even though it is technically not correct, we have to judge it by its purpose in the speech and say, he's not concerned about enumerating which ones were there at a certain time. The point is there were 75 descendants of Jacob there, as forming the nucleus of the people in Egypt. So verse 15, Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our ancestors died. So the whole family moved there and grew there. And he skips several hundred years. Verse 16, their bodies were, after the Exodus, were brought back to Shechem and placed in the tomb that Abraham had bought from the sons of Hamor at Shechem for a certain sum of money. Here again, if we compare it to the original in Genesis 50, we'll find out that Stephen made a bit of an error, or something that at least we cannot learn from Genesis anyway. Genesis says that Abraham bought a field near Mamre. And let's see, in Genesis 33, I quote that there too, it was Jacob who bought the field from the sons of Hamor. So there's a little mix up there in actually who bought which field. Again, those details are not important for Stephen's purpose. His point is that they were brought back to the land of Judea. Shechem is north of Jerusalem, in the land of what was then known as Samaria. It was the same place as the capital city of Samaria, whereas the other field was near Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem. So they were kind of opposite directions, but still both in the area of the Holy Land. So they were still, they went down to Egypt and they brought them back. They didn't bring back every descendant after that, but the main patriarchs they did. And their tombs were in the area in that day. Actually, there were rival tombs. The Samaritans agreed that Joseph was, let's see, I forget which. They agreed that someone was buried in Shechem. They agreed that others were buried in Hebron. But some of the other patriarchs, they had rival tombs. They said, Issachar is buried here. But the Jews said, no, Issachar is buried here. And they didn't have a firm tradition about exactly where these things were. They did know, because Genesis told them, that Abraham bought a field and that Jacob also bought a field for burial. And I think the point there was that they had to buy these fields. They were not they didn't inherit them. God had not given them the land until the days of the Exodus. So verse 17, that's where Stephen comes to at that point. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, that is, we see earlier in the chapter that God had promised Abraham that his descendants would be mistreated in the land of Egypt for 400 years and then come out. So this promise, the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham and bring them out of Egypt. The number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. So Stephen's just zipping through the story fairly quickly. And he says, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing. Literally, it says that who did not know of Joseph. Of course, the king would have had access to all the records. The records would have been there. But so here the NIV is kind of giving the sense of it. They're treating it as an idiom that it's like, I don't even know you. And I think Jesus uses a similar figure of speech when in one of the parables, and he says, depart from me, I never knew you. I did not have a relationship with you the way I wanted. He did know about them, but he did not know them in the sense of having a good and friendly relationship. So this new king didn't care for Joseph. He came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people, oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. Well, there was a lot of other oppression going on there too, with slavery and making bricks without straw and other details in Genesis that Stephen doesn't have time for, but he just gets to the point. At that time, verse 20, Moses was born, so he was going to rescue his people. He was no ordinary child. Here again, we are dealing with some kind of idiom. Some manuscripts say he was fair in the sight of God, trying to give a meaning for what it would mean. He was a beautiful child, Josephus says. He was a good-looking baby. Well, okay, that's not why they saved him. They didn't save him because of his beauty. They saved him because he was theirs. His mother, mothers always think their own babies are the most beautiful in the world. So she wanted to save him as long as she could. And God was going to use that as a method for delivering his people. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Genesis tells us it was in a river, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. And apparently, the ruling family of Egypt at that time did have a school for foreign-born children, kind of a school of royalty. So this was not without precedent that Pharaoh's daughter could say, "Oh yes, this is a good-looking child, a good-looking baby. Let's put him, let's raise him up and put him in our school. We will have a international group of young leaders, getting the best of all these worlds." And many empires at that time did have various internationals involved in their administration because they were valuable in knowing the languages of other areas. As one person commented, it says that, people just didn't have ordinary scribes. Almost all of the scribes knew more than one language because they had to deal with so many different languages in different parts of their empire. They had to be able to translate and record records and communicate with officials in different areas. So they had some value or appreciation for foreigners. Egypt was a little more less likely to do that. This was only during one of the dynasties in which they were more open to foreigners. Egypt is easy to be self-contained and to view themselves as better than all others. So they took in Moses. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, went to school there, and was powerful in speech and action. Here, Stephen's adding a little bit to what the story in Genesis tells us, but it's part of their the legends of the Jews that we see in the writings of Josephus and things like that this was part of their understanding, and it's quite likely from what we know of the way Egypt worked at the time. Verse 23, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He knew that he was by birth. They had told him that much. Verse 24, he saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. So here Stephen is putting a little bit of rationale or motive behind what Moses did, that Moses thought that he would be a deliverer for his people. But God hadn't called him to that yet. He called himself to that yet, and it was a bit early. It wasn't going to work. See, he killed the Egyptian, and killing an Egyptian carried with it a capital offense. If it was found out, then he would have been killed himself. Verse 25, Moses thought his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. Here again, I think Stephen is using this example as a comparison to Jesus. As the people did not recognize Moses as their deliverer, so they did not recognize Jesus as their deliverer. So there's a parallel there that he kind of implies, brings out. He will bring out more forcefully a little later. 26, the next day Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you're brothers, why do you want to hurt each other?" He was trying to be a leader for his people. Even though they asked him to or anything like that. He didn't really have any direct authority to, but that's what he was trying to do. The man who was, verse 27, the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" So here Stephen is quoting from Exodus and quoting it accurately. Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When he heard this, he was afraid. He was afraid he'd be found out. So he fled to Midian. Egypt did have some connections with Midian out in the Sinai desert. That's where Egypt got, there were copper mines out there that Egypt got copper from. So they had trade connections with Midian in the desert. Moses knew how to get there, and there were oases along the way that made it possible for him to travel. He settled in Midian as a foreigner and had 2 sons. Verse 30, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. After Moses had worked for 40 years as a shepherd, it was time for a change of job. So God gave him a different job. Now this Genesis doesn't say anything about this angel, but this had become part of the legends of the Jews as well. And there's even another occurrence of this later in Acts that I'll comment on when we get there. When Moses saw this burning bush, he was amazed at the sight. He went over to get a closer look, and he heard the Lord say, and then Stephen has quite a section there, which he basically quotes from Scripture. He takes it in a slightly different order. Exodus 3, he does verse 6 before he does verse 5. And he could have done it either way, but he starts off with God revealing himself. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Moses said he hid his face. And the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Those details, Stephen doesn't do anything with those details. It's just part of the story as he recounts the major points in the story. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I've heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. I will send you back to Egypt. So God's not going to do it directly. He's going to do it through Moses. Verse 35, this is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge? He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. People have rejected Moses, but that is precisely the person that God used to deliver. So there's some parallel there to Jesus again. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, this was near the end of his life, in the book of Deuteronomy, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. And he also adds, and he's the one you're supposed to listen to. So Stephen is saying that Jesus is, well, he doesn't directly say it, but that's the implication here. Moses is pointing toward a future, Stephen says, is Jesus. So there's some continuity there. Stephen is saying, in this context of defending himself against accusations, he's saying, no, I'm not teaching against the law. I'm not teaching against Moses. I am teaching you the fulfillment of what Moses had said. He's trying to bring out there's a continuity there. And the reason, now, he didn't say this, the reason that Moses said that God will raise up a prophet like me from your own people is because what Moses said permanent. More needed to be revealed. If Moses, the law of Moses was the end of the story, there would not need to be a prophet like me from your own people. So in that prophecy, there's kind of a hint of something else yet to come that would do away with, at least change something about what Moses had said. Verse 38, he, Moses, was in the assembly. Assembly is the Greek word ekklesia, usually translated church. So there's some parallel here with there's some continuity with the Christian believers with the Jewish heritage. But Stephen does not bring out any to that, but he does use the same word. So Moses was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai. That angel who spoke on Mount Sinai, Exodus does not mention any angel on Mount Sinai. The Jewish tradition is, and the Greek translation of the books of Moses did talk about angels. Deuteronomy 33, verse 2. The Greek translation says that there were, when God came with myriads of holy ones. Greek translation said those were angels. The book of Hebrews mentions angels in connection with the giving of the law, Hebrews chapter 2. So there too, they have used the same understanding of what was going on in Exodus. Moses was in with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai with our ancestors. He received living words to pass on to us. So Stephen is saying positive, favorable things about the law. But our ancestors refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him, and in their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. That summarizes a lot of the story, too. In their hearts, they actually physically tried to return at one point to Egypt, chose some kind of leader and wanted to go back, but all of that failed. But their point was that it was the Israelite peoples who were rejecting Moses. It wasn't Stephen. This is the Israelite history. The Israelites told Aaron, verse 40, make us gods who will go before us, and the golden calf. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. He had been on Mount Sinai for 40 days, and that was the limit of their patience, apparently. He disappeared. They didn't want to go up to find him. They just wanted to go back to Egypt, where there was slavery. And there are parallels with what Christians do today sometimes too. They sometimes go back into slavery, or look wistfully at the good old days when they could do whatever they wanted, or they could God's law in some way, and they thought that gave them more freedom. But no, that's returning to slavery. So this, verse 41, this was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. That's one of the humorous stories in the Bible, where Aaron gives the excuse, I took the gold and threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. Yeah, right. There is humor scattered in the Bible that you have to kind of be aware that it's there so you can see it. Just still a few humorous things too. So they brought sacrifices to that idol, and they reveled in what their own hands had made. Now this word hands, a significant one for the Jewish leaders at the time. They made fun of pagans for worshiping things that their hands had made. And is going to turn that against them by saying, hands also made the temple that you are so enamored with. So it's important to put things in context here. So then what this idol, this calf that their hands had made, but God turned away from them, gave them over. This was another significant word for Jewish apologetics or arguments against the Gentiles. Paul uses this word in the book of Romans when he says that God gave them over to do whatever they wanted. This was part of his punishment for the Gentiles wanting to do sinful things. He said, oh, all right, let's go ahead and do it. You're going to suffer the results. But this word gave them over. The Jews had used this against the Gentiles. Here, Stephen is pointing at using it against the Israelites. God gave them over to do these Gentile things, worship of the sun, moon, stars. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets, which Amos was written centuries later, but as Amos is summarizing what happened in the days of the Exodus. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, you people of Israel? You've taken up the tabernacle of Molech. Molech is the god of Moab. And it's Genesis has the shrine of your king. It's the Hebrew word for king is very similar to Molech. When the Greek translation was made, they turned king into Molech, Malach to Molech. And then Amos says, and he's taken up the star of your god Rephan. They're not quite sure who Rephan is. They think maybe he is an Egyptian god. But anyway, the point is that the people just after they'd come out of Egypt, given them the law, They rebelled against the law and wanted to go right back into idolatry. Therefore, he says, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. It says Damascus, but Stephen has here kind of updated it with more, a little more history, knowing that they not only went beyond Damascus, they went beyond Babylon. They were taken captive by Babylonians and taken to different parts of Babylonia, some of parts of which were past Babylon. See, in the New Testament, or in Stephen's speech for that matter, they don't have ending quote marks. So we don't know exactly where he starts quoting and when he starts putting in his own words. And here we can see that he's deviated a little bit away from the original text of Amos. So it's like just put in the end quote marks a little sooner, and then Stephen updates it with saying beyond Babylon. Verse 44, our ancestors had the tabernacle of the covenant law with them in the wilderness. Another positive mention of the law. It had been made as God directed Moses, according to the pattern Moses had seen. God revealed what this should look like, detailed descriptions in the books of Moses on all the dimensions, the materials, and how this was constructed. So this was a divinely given place where God was to be worshipped. Verse 45, after receiving the tabernacle, our ancestors, Joshua, brought it with them when they took the land from the nations God drove out before them in the land of Canaan. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. The NIV footnote mentions there that some manuscripts have the house of Jacob, the dynasty. I think the better point is that David wanted to provide a dwelling place for God. Well, he already had one in the tabernacle, but David thought that a permanent building would be better. Verse 47, but it was Solomon who built a house for him. So here then, Stephen turns a little bit against the temple. Says, the tabernacle had God's approval, but the temple, that was David's idea. And Solomon brought it about. But verse 48, however, the Most High does not live in houses made with hands. There he's using that word that they used against the Gentiles. And of course, Solomon recognized that. His prayer of dedication at the temple said, heavens cannot contain God. He is much bigger than any of this. So this temple, as grand as it is but a token representation of God's glory. And God filled the temple with his glory. I did give it a seal of approval. It was not a pagan building in that way. But Stephen is bringing out the point that the temple was made with human hands. As the prophet says, Isaiah specifically, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things? You can't make me anything that I don't already have. And then suddenly in verse 51, the tone of the speech just changes from explanation to accusation. He's using the second person plural, you guys, instead of us as people of Israel. You stiff-necked people. That's what the ancient Israelites were called in the Exodus wanderings. your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. He says that means they're like Gentiles. You're just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. So he is saying, your accusations against me, your rejection of Jesus as the leader, all of those are examples of resisting the Holy Spirit. Verse 52, was there ever a prophet that your ancestors did not persecute? Probably one or two. But in general, people rejected the prophets that were sent to them. The prophets told them where they were doing wrong. People didn't like that. They would reject the prophets. They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. Isaiah, tradition says, was sawn in two. We see that in Hebrews chapter 11. Referring to someone sawn in two, because that was Isaiah. So the people who predicted the Messiah, the Jews might say, oh, yes, we want a Messiah. But they look at their own history and they say, we killed the prophets who predicted that Messiah. But they wanted the Messiah according to their own definition of what they wanted, and not the kind of leadership that God wanted to give them. And now you have betrayed and murdered him, Jesus. You who have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. He said, you are accusing me of teaching against the law, but you are the people who have always been rejecting it and disobeying it. He's not really defending himself so much as he is turning the tables on them. Verse 54, the Sanhedrin heard this. They were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. I'm not sure how people gnash their teeth. Some say grinding their teeth. If I grind my teeth, it's hard for somebody else to see it. So it's like, how do I grind my teeth against somebody else or at someone? I'm not sure. But the picture that comes to mind is of chimpanzees who, when they're in a fight, they're chomping their teeth. That's why people would do this whenever they're angry. I'm not sure, but it was some kind of symbol made with their teeth of that they were angry. They were angry at Stephen for accusing them. Verse 55, but Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Well, wait a minute. Isn't Jesus sitting at the right hand of God? What's he standing for? There are a couple of suggestions, probably more than that. But one is he is standing as a judge. The judge pronounced a verdict. The judge would stand. So one idea is that Jesus is the judge standing here to kind of give his verdict that the accusers, Stephen's accusers, were guilty of what he was saying.
Mike, I have a question.
The whole courtroom trial has been turned around. Instead of the Sanhedrin being the judges, and they are the being judged. And yeah, it's a complete reversal of what might be involved in a trial. And the other is that Jesus was standing simply out of surprise or welcome. Different ideas have been suggested there. I think the idea that he's a judge giving a verdict has. at this, they covered their ears, like they don't want to hear anything more. They think he is already blasphemed, and they don't want to hear this blasphemy. And yelling at the top of their voices, that maybe to drown him out, maybe just to, as part of the mob mentality. They all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Jews at this time were not allowed to kill people. Romans didn't allow them to carry out the death penalty. That's why whenever they wanted Jesus to be killed, they had to trump up some charges that he was being seditious against the state, so to make it a political crime rather than a religious one. So what the Sanhedrin are doing here in killing Stephen was illegal. It was kind of a mob action, a lynching. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. I point out that this is, again, a reversal of a normal Jewish trial. And this evidence comes from the rabbis, rabbinic writings from a few centuries later. So it may not have necessarily been the custom in the first century at the time of Stephen, but the idea was that somebody that was going to be stoned to death would have the coat removed. Yet here, it is here the accusers who remove their coats. So it's kind of a bit of a reversal. And we don't see any other purpose for why Stephen or why Luke includes this detail of the story. So the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. It is possible that Theophilus did not know who Saul was. He probably knew the name Paul, but he did not have known that Paul was originally named Saul. So Luke is just dropping Saul into the story with very little explanation. So here he is, a young man named Saul. And Luke will pick up that hint a little bit later on. And he does that with a few other characters. He just mentions the character and then later brings out their role in the story. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." What Jesus said on the cross. And he fell on his knees and cried out, "Lord, do not hold your sin against them." Similar to what Jesus did on the cross. When he had said this, he fell asleep. Euphemism. Don't fall asleep when you're being stoned unless you go unconscious. And that was part of whenever they stoned someone, they tried to use big stones, but not to torture the person, but to kill them. In chapter 8, verse 1, and Saul approved of their killing him. Saul was not actually throwing stones. And it's not completely sure why. He was part of the group. Helped coordinate their work, for all we know. But he was not involved in throwing stones. He was just keeping their coats. And he was a young man. He may not have been old enough to be a member of the Sanhedrin itself. These are details that we don't have enough information to be sure. And then chapter 8, verse 1, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. So here there were several thousand believers. They decided to get out of town. Things were getting hot. But all the apostles stayed. Some, yeah, and the question is, well, why? Some think that, well, it was primarily the Greek-speaking Christians who were threatened by this stoning of Stephen. They were in the same circles as the men who had accused Stephen. So they would have been felt the most fear. And they think, well, maybe the Hebrew-speaking people, believers, stayed with the apostles. Those details are not quite clear. It does say godly men buried Stephen, so there were at least some godly men still around. Deeply for him, which was against the Jewish law to mourn for someone who had been stoned as a blasphemer. But some godly men did this anyway. Not everybody fled, at least instantly. In verse 2, Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. Where was that? In Jerusalem? Was there still enough Christians in Jerusalem for him to do that? Or was he going to the outlying villages in Judea? And it's interesting there, and there at the end of verse 1, Samaria. It is an unusual place for a Jewish person to flee to, because Jews and Samaritans did not get along. I figured they would be free from persecution there. The Jewish leaders wouldn't follow them into Samaria. And helps Luke drops in a little hint of something yet to come, which comes very soon in this case. Philip goes to Samaria. So Saul began to destroy the church, or at least attempted to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women, and that was unusual, to drag off women, put them in prison. Apparently, the gospel was being spread by women as well as by men, and Saul thought that they were dangerous as well. So, and Luke does tell us about some of the women involved in telling the story of the resurrection of Jesus. Put them in prison. They didn't have a lot of prison space. I'm not sure how many people this could have been. Even because they didn't put people in prison as a form of punishment. People were in prison to await trial. So they didn't have a lot of space in prison. So I'm not sure where Stephen would have put them, or how many he would have. But anyway, his intent was to persecute, put them in prison, to put them on trial, and in what way would they be punished? The legal punishment for someone who was breaking the rules of the religious leaders was to be beaten with rods, or 39 or 40 lashes minus 1, 39 lashes. So I don't remember how they came up with that number, but it was rarely as they were not allowed to put them to death, although a mob apparently did in this case. So just what Stephen was doing with these people in prison, we're not quite sure. But the point that Luke wants to make here is that the church was being persecuted. Because the church was being persecuted, verse 4, those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they were. This is an important development in the story, because finally, in Acts 1, Jesus had told the apostles to be his witnesses in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the world. Here, they're finally getting out of Jerusalem. In this case, verse 5, Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaim the Messiah there. Now, with our maps, we tend to go down, means south, but in this case, he's going north to Samaria. And probably, it's probably the largest city in Samaria, the capital, called Sebaste at the time. That's the Greek word for Augustus. The city had been named after Augustus Caesar. Just means someone honored, glorified in some way, Sebastian. So that's where this story probably occurred. When we hear about a Simon a little bit later, who was a great magician attracting a large crowd, he probably would have gone to the largest city in order to be able to do that. But we can pick up the story there next week. A few minutes for comments or questions. I hope this never happens to you.
It's interesting that Jesus stood as the high priest. He stood at the incident of the first Christian martyr under the new covenant.
Right, yeah, the first Christian martyr. And martyr is the Greek word which means witness. You'll be my witness. Yeah, but a lot of those who were witnesses were martyred, and thus the word took on a new meaning.
Hey, Mike. This is really interesting. One of the longest sermons probably in the Bible with Stephen. Obviously, he knows a lot about the Bible. Probably he had a lot of inspiration by the Holy Spirit. And then also the writer himself, Luke, he was able to capture all that detail of the sermons. So it's partly inspiration. And do you think there are also some other witnesses where Luke was able to compile all of that, kind of, quoting the sermon itself? And another question I have is, Luke chose to post or publish that very long sermon. How does that help with his purpose for Theophilus? Then it's
Yeah.
long one, right?
Yeah. Get his information. One possible source would have been Paul. Paul could well have remembered what made him so angry about Stephen. I mean, this was not exactly a turning point in his life, but it was certainly a dramatic thing for him. So Paul could have remembered parts of it, and then Luke also had other contacts in the early church that he could have also asked about that. And those people who know Greek language better than I do, Luke uses a somewhat different style in this speech, as if it is based on actual records. It's not written completely in Luke's own style. It has some, what they would call archaism, old ways of speaking that might reflect what Stephen would have actually used. And how does this flow in, or how does this serve Luke's purpose in the story? A couple of things, I think, is that one is that it shows a peak of persecution. That persecution then led to the spreading of the church. So that helped propel the church to new areas and new places. So that purpose in that way. It's so long, he takes longer than is necessary for that specific purpose. During the speech, he is able to bring out some points about Judaism itself. Luke is writing, Jews and Gentiles are beginning to separating from one another. And some people wonder why. Why is that? Some of Paul's speeches address prophecies of the Messiah and how the Christians differ from Jewish beliefs. This Stephen covers some of that too, but it has very little overlap with the way Paul preaches. It has something different in there. So even though, say, Luke gives several speeches of Paul, even though Paul may have said the same things in many different locations, Luke varies the speeches. He's giving us a little segment of this one and a different segment of that one to give variety to his story. He puts it together. So he's kind of separating out the various points that early Christian leaders made in their debates with Jews, and he separates out different parts of it to different peoples. Stephen's speech could have been much, much longer than what we have actually recorded here. He could have, spoken for an hour, for all we know. Certainly, Paul's speeches were longer than what Luke records. He's just giving us a little segment, but he's using the opportunity. He's not trying to have each person cover every topic. He's pulling out certain things for Stephen to say, pulling things out of Stephen's speech for Stephen to say, these are the things that kind of unique to you. So these were the things I will highlight. These other things, Paul will cover that later, so I will save that for some of Paul's speeches later. That answer your question?
Yeah, that's very logical, especially also the aspect of able to introduce Saul, because Saul will be a big personality after that, and he's got to be introduced, and kind of a very interesting introduction, very dramatic, the way Saul is introduced.
The dramatic change in Paul. If we didn't have the book of Acts, we just had Paul's epistles, we would wonder, where on earth did this come from? It is so different from the Gospels, for example, that the book of Acts provides this connection that helps us see how we got from A to B, or from Christ to Paul. Paul preaches a lot about Christ, but he's saying something significantly different. How did this happen? And the book of Acts gives us some of the backstory behind Paul's epistles that help us see where they fit in.
Yeah, and Luke worked with Paul in some ways too. So they know each other.
Yes.
Because I've always wondered when I was younger, why didn't the book of Acts mention anything about the other apostles? I'm sure they gave sermons like James. He was beheaded. Earlier on, what did he say? He got beheaded, but none of those were recorded. But Stephen's long sermon was recorded, I think, because of Paul.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it does have that tie-in to Paul. Luke did quote some speeches of Peter as showing continuity with the earliest leaders of the church. So there's some transition there. But yeah, most of the apostles, Luke does not worry about where they went or what they said. And here, even in chapter 8, he works with, there was an apostle named Philip, but this is not the fellow he's talking about. He's talking about the deacon named Philip. So it's very selective in the parts of the story he tells, because Theophilus is not in Egypt. He's not worried about which apostle went to Egypt. Theophilus is not in India. He's not worried about Thomas and the legends that Thomas went to India. Theophilus is probably in the Greek-speaking part of the empire where Paul went to. So that's the connection that Luke wants to make for his readers. The part that Luke knows the most about too, since he was with Paul. Oh, Judy, you have a question?
Yes, I don't know whether I'm live or not. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I am.
Okay. What fascinates me is we have Jesus is sacrificed. All the stories of his resurrection go around. And then they wait until Jesus returns to heaven, and then they receive the Spirit. The apostles receive the Spirit. The whole time, that whole time period, up and even until Stephen is giving his sermon, there was a lot of anger and a lot of things going on in Jerusalem between the people in the temple, the priests and the high priest and everybody. It was a lot going on there, yet we don't hear much of that, except we see Stephen and what happens to him. And we have to realize how much anger and resistance there was going on in Jerusalem, that they were just not receiving this at all.
Yeah, earlier I pointed out, that word jealousy. They had to be jealous of the popularity of the apostolic movement.
They were not only jealous, they were just bloody angry. And they weren't gonna, they did not believe it, and they weren't gonna receive it. And I think it's sort of like the Jews and the Gentiles were separating out at this point, because the Gentiles saw, this is Jesus, and the Jews must have been so angry.
Yeah, that's really, irritation is a soft word, huh?
Yes.
Cecilia, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, I was stuck at the point where the witnesses were laying down their coats. And what occurs to me is the Sanhedrin rushed at Stephen, then the witnesses they laid down their coats. It's almost like you were saying, crowd mentality, and a lot of violence sort of took place over in a rush. And then Paul got pulled into it or drawn into it in some way. But what it made me think about is it's similar to what's going on today. You could almost relate it to how there's a lot of anger and fear and turmoil going on in the city, and yet the gospel got preached. The gospel was spread despite all of these scary things that were happening.
Right.
Like in contrast to everything that's going on, God's will still was getting done.
The main character in the book of Acts is God. God has planned it, he executes it all the way through. He's in charge. That's meta story.
Excuse me, God is the main character right now, and sometimes we don't realize it. What is going on with this COVID-19 and some of the protests and actions and things that are being said, God is getting the gospel out, because he knows he has there's little time and he has to get the gospel out and he's going to make sure that it's done. We're sort of slow on the draw, I think.
All right, God is still in charge. All right, well, we're over past due, so we can end. And thank everybody. Yeah, thank you all for your.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate
All right.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you next week.
Thank you.
Have a great
Bye.
2 days until worship services. All right, bye.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Nice.
All right.
Night.